Hey everyone, my name is Charlie and today I have my top 10 books of 2020 list. I did not record one of these for 2019 and I've already uploaded a photo of all these books to Instagram, and I can't say as I will have anything enlightening to say, for it has been almost a year since I read some of these books. All we need to know is that they're firm favourites, that they will linger in my house, and that it means I plan on rereading them one day. I don't rank my books because it feels like too much of a stress for me, and also because when I read these books, they end up being favourites for very different reasons. They all deal with different aspects of what I like to see in fiction. One shock for me this year has been the fact that there is so much historical fiction in this list, because previously it's been a genre that I've said that I don't get on with. I find it somewhat difficult to read historical books, which is weird when I don't share that same difficulty with Victorian or classic literature. I don't know what it is. It's just something in my brain that says I'm not going to like that. But this list proves that I shouldn't have thought that. Anyway, the first book on this list is Patsy by Nicole Dennis-Benn. I have to say that when this book got kicked out of the BookTube prize, I was shocked, I was appalled, I was upset, I was wondering what my other judges were thinking, and I'm over it. I'm not over it. Patsy follows the character of Patsy, who decides to leave her daughter and go and see the person who she believes is the love of her life. And she arrives in New York to discover that her lover actually is married now and has an abusive husband, and Patsy becomes one of the lost migrants in America. Meanwhile, her daughter True is back in Jamaica, wondering just why their mother left them and discovering their own gender identity at a time when they really could do with having this parental figure there. The style of writing here gave a sense that you were being pushed upon, like it felt very tight and oppressive. And I felt like that was used to emphasise some of the perhaps depression and sadness that the protagonist is feeling. And this is a book where sadness does unfortunately permeate, but I love that about this tale. I know that certain other readers questioned just how a mother could come to abandon their child, but in terms of Patsy, it made sense for me. It made, like, on the one hand, I was rooting for Patsy because she is taking control of her own life and doesn't want to be confined with this child. Now, I understand that as a mother she has taken on this responsibility, so then at the same time there is this question of how could you leave your daughter like that, but you're rooting for her as well, at least I was. But also there was this part of me that did want to see her reunited with True, because you get to see the struggle that True is going through. Therefore, as a reader, I'm left conflicted, because this book is Patsy's story, but it is also the story of so many others. I saw Patsy as not just the name, but also this sense of cowardice that Patsy has given up on being a parent, trying to find the ideal life, not recognising that she won't be able to find the ideal life, and also she's searching for happiness, not knowing that you can't find happiness in other people. It's just one of those brilliant books for me, that whilst I went through it with this overwhelming sense of sadness for the characters, there was also some hope whenever Patsy would encounter certain people or when things would happen to her daughter. It's an interesting take on parenthood, and it has stuck with me throughout the entire year, because I think I read this back in February. The next book we have here is The Eighth Life by Nino Haratischvili and is edited by Charlotte Collins and Ruth Martin. This is an exceptionally long 940-page tome. It is a family epic, and at first I didn't know how I was going to feel about this book, because I got it believing there was going to be reference to Chocolat by Joanne Harris with this talk of this cursed chocolate recipe. Then you discover that it's just that the patriarchal figure in this family believes that it's cursed because whenever someone happens to try and sample the hot chocolate they make, it leads to tragedy within the family. If this book was to be adapted, I think it would work exceptionally well as a series of television dramas. It talks about a part of the world that and its history that I didn't know anything about, and yet it does it by keeping the family and the characters at its core. Even though there are aspects where the author will give you historical context and she writes it in such a manner that it just seems fitting as to the story, and it feels like the narrator is coming in and giving you this talk, but it does it in just in an incredibly poetic way. Even though I don't particularly like the final part of this story and think that could have been expanded upon as a side sequel, really. It feels like a completely different style of story. It feels like a road trip novel, the final part does. This didn't detract from this being one of my favourite books of the year. The characters, again, have stuck in my head, and there are certain scenes that are definitely imprinted in my mind, and I'll think about them and think, oh yeah, that's that book. Yes, it is dark, but it also, and I mean incredibly dark, there are things that happen in here that just go to show the horrors of war and the impact it can have on a person's mental health, but it also shows how families intertwine with each other and how past relationships in a family can go on to hinder or help the later relationships. It also, this cyclical nature of the novel helps to emphasise how parents cannot stop their children from making the same mistakes as them. I was particularly fond of it, as I'm fond of all of these books. It's 940 pages, it takes some time, it takes reading it slowly, it takes putting this hefty tome down on a table. I'd probably recommend getting the paperback and breaking the spine a few times, but it's definitely worth everyone's time. Next, we have Mr. Loverman by Bernardine Evaristo. When I first read Girl, Woman, Other, I didn't particularly understand what Evaristo was getting at. And then I read this book. And this book, for whatever reason, just made me understand where the writer was coming from. This tells the story of Barrington, who has had a male lover since his teens, but married a woman and had children because of the pressure from society to be the man that he was not. But now, after however many years of marriage, in his 70s, he has decided that he's going to leave his wife and come out and begin this relationship with Morris. I adore this book. This book talks about sexuality, especially sexuality in the older community, but also in the Antiguan community as well, and how Barrington was made to feel about his feelings. You get this sense that he does love his lover and his wife, but also doesn't want to upset the family in any way. But in not wanting to do that, he's actually harming his family. And Evaristo talks about all of these themes whilst also managing to have the reader rooting for Barrington, and she has humour in there as well. Having Barrington as the protagonist here really goes to show the shift in attitudes over the years, and I was glad to see his character represented here, because there are so many people you'll meet who aren't coming out until later life because they just didn't feel like it was possible back when they were realising who they were. And I think that books like this shine a light on that aspect of our world, our communities, and all that fun stuff. Next, I have The Miseducation of Evie Epworth by Matson Taylor. This follows 16-year-old Evie Epworth, who doesn't really know what she's doing with her life. She's left school, she's stolen her father's car, she's crashed it through a dry stone wall whilst out delivering the milk, and thus begins an incredible comedy that draws on storytelling skills from classic British comedy and reminded me of Roy Clarke with Last of the Summer Wine. It had very strong, independent northern women in it, and reminded me so much of the world that I have tried to create in the Doris books as well, with the backbiting W.I. Fates and the way that Christine behaves. Evie Epworth reminds me of tales my mother told me of growing up in the 60s and the way the world was then, and there's this sense of community and everyone knowing each other's business, and I think that Matson Taylor just captured the time and the place exceptionally well here, as well as being comedic, because this is an incredibly predictable story that we have seen done before, and because of that I shouldn't like it, but as with everything, it's in the telling, and Matson Taylor does it with such a firm eye. It is humorous and the characters still feel real, and they are characters that we all know. And as I said in my review of this, which I'll leave a link to in the description, it felt like a love letter to the north of England and to Yorkshire and to all these strong northern women, and I thoroughly adored this. I love to see northern representation in fiction, and it's just brilliant and exactly what I look for in fiction. I read it twice. Then we have Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell, a book I never expected to like because I haven't actually cared for the works of O'Farrell's that I've read in the past. This is the story of Shakespeare's son Hamnet, who tragically dies. Now, if I thought I was going to be reminded of Joanne Harris's works with The Eighth Life, and I was wrong, I was here. Hamnet's mother, Agnes, is a healer. I think that she would perhaps be known as something like a witch nowadays. This gives the book a touch of magic. Then we have the spectre of death. I really have to stop reading all these books about death because I have an obsession and I don't think it's healthy, but there we go. And this book is all about death, specifically the death of a child, but because of that, and it's talking about the plague at the time, and there is this, as I say, the spectre of death looming over the entirety of the novel that brings grief in the second part, which I thought was explored exceptionally well indeed. Maggie O'Farrell here had fantastic writing, really, really strong, well thought out characters, and everyone who said this talked about the fact that Shakespeare was never mentioned. And I think that that's important because I think people would go into this book expecting something Shakespearean. And I do believe there are certain hints towards Shakespeare in here and certain nods to his work, but that's more just to colour the narrative. It's never the be-all and end-all, the entire essence. The essence here is a story of a mother's grief and the difficulty in being a mother anyway, and how society is going to already looks on Agnes before she has her children. And then we also have this discussion of the family and of the world at the time. Maggie O'Farrell really did pack a lot in here, and it's an incredibly emotive book that if I had a heart, I might have shed a tear over, but I didn't go that far. Also, Hamnet is a child character that didn't piss me off. Sometimes you get these whiny children like in Oliver Twist, where I'm just like, no, you aren't a child, you are just a mithering mess. But Hamnet felt real, and I think that that is what has impacted so many readers with this tale, is that we have a character, a child character, who actually felt like a child character, and it does feel very much like you're getting to know him, only for that time to be cut short. And yeah, don't think about any younger relatives you might have in your life whilst reading this book, because you will probably end up breaking your own heart then when certain inevitable things happen. Then we have David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. This is a book that I read over a month. There is an entire vlog of me destroying this book, so I will leave a link to that in the description as well, because I don't want to talk about this book too much. I read this book as an experiment to see whether I would be able to annotate a book as I did when I had to do English literature. And I did tabs and that, and I broke the spine, and it really helped me to interact with the book more, as well as breaking it apart and reading it slowly. In here, Dickens has an obsession with death and time that I think you can see in a lot of his other works. But also in this book, what Dickens does that I liked is that he has a huge amount of orphans, and in having all of these orphans, what he does is show you all of the different ways that Copperfield's life could have gone had he lived his life a bit differently. And I like that. It was like getting to see all these different parallel universes. I am still upset that there wasn't a homosexual romance between David Copperfield and Steerforth. I think that it was there. I think that it was in the subtext from the way that Steerforth talked to David and called him his Daisy. And I really think that marrying David off was a mistake, because all we got was David not being the kindest to his wife, who was a bit too much of a caricature and just annoyed me. And I would completely rewrite the latter half of this and just have Steerforth and Copperfield running off together to embark upon a life in the mountains with all their money. But that's not the book I got. I still interacted with this book in a way that I hadn't interacted with any other book this year, so it's here. Then I read Flames by Robbie Arnott, or Arnott, I'm not sure. Either way, I can't explain this book, but it reminded me of David Mitchell in a Cloud Atlas type way, in that each chapter follows a different character, all working, and each chapter kind of works like a jigsaw piece, all coming together to tell this story. There's magic in here, there's magical wombats, there are tales of gods, and there is also this story of family, because when the mother dies at the start of this book, she comes back a few days later before her body sets fire, and then you get the history of that right towards the end of the story, which kind of builds it to this cyclical nature that also has this culmination in the end. I got this book out of the library a year ago, still haven't returned it, don't know when I'll be able to. I've just acquired The Rain Heron, and I need to get my own copy of this book, because I would love to be able to write something like this one day. I have a book in mind that I have been planning for years, and if I was able to pull it off in the way that Robbie Arnott has pulled off Flames, then I would be incredibly happy indeed, because this is just marvellous, really, and the mind and the thought that has worked. This book, as a writer, must be so complicated to write, yet it reads so easily. I am in awe, I am impressed, and I'm so glad that this book exists, really. Then we move on to Nudibranch by Irenosen Okojie, a collection of short stories that are dark and magical and mystical, and I would just love to know what goes on in the author's mind, because these stories are fantastic. Of course, there are the stories in here that I didn't particularly get, but sometimes I just love the fact that you get lost in sentences and you'd have to kind of find your way out as though they were mazes. Sometimes it worked to great effect and sometimes it didn't, but the majority of the stories in here are showstoppers. It's like Alaska Thunderfuck's run on All Stars 2. There's barely a dud. It's just great. I don't know how else to explain it, really, other than I adored it. I look forward to rereading these stories in future. It felt as though Okojie was creating their own new labyrinth and library of myths and legends, and I was here for them. I was here for the discussion of people in the modern day linking to this new sort of folklore. I like the metaphors that the author created in order to give you this allegory to tell the story as well. It's just fantastic, amazing, show-stopping, awesome. Then we have Piranesi by Susanna Clarke, which I read in November, and I am still not sure how I feel about it, except that I know that it's on the favourites list and it's in my top 10, because this reads like a backwards thriller. I said that in my wrap-up, and that's because everything that should happen before, it's like you're entering into this story in the climax of a thriller. So you have this man in this maze, this labyrinth. You don't know where he is. He's not really sure of his own identity. He just has this other guy who all you know about him is that he's a bit of a dick, that he's malevolent. You can tell from the get-go that he's an enemy. But Piranesi is relying on him to bring him shoes and to bring him other things. And he's, over time, piecing together back the person that he was. And the narrative follows that, but it also does it in this magical way, and it's confusing. And again, similar to stories in Nudie Branch, you get lost in this maze of the writing until eventually everything starts to pull together and the real world starts to infringe upon the story as well, and you're not really sure what's good and what's bad, and it gives this sense of unsurety to it that just appealed in the end. As a reader, you're able to piece together what's gone on, but there are still questions left at the end, and I appreciated that too, because sometimes you don't want every single story wrapped up in a bow. There's not much more I can say about it, really. I liked it. I should also point out, as we get towards the end of this video, and I recognise I've been filming for so long and I've not had any coffee yet today, my ability to talk about these books is waning. But the final book I have to talk about is Utopia Avenue by David Mitchell. I only finished reading this past Monday, which is less than a week ago, but it had to be included on my favourite books of the year list because David Mitchell had to make it onto my favourite books of the year list. He was originally going to be here with the Bone Clocks, and then I read this book. This is the tale of a band. This is set in the 1960s. It evokes time and setting and place and all that stuff really well. The characters feel well formed, and it also links to Mitchell's other works with the character of Jasper de Zoot, I should say. And then we have the metaphysical aspects of Mitchell's stories that we usually see. There are also links with certain characters that might have appeared before in Mitchell's work, but this story was a story of creatives and a story of music, and again a love letter to music and the bands of the past, with this new band being put together, Utopia Avenue. I'm still wondering just what inspired Mitchell to create this book and what bands appealed to him and their stories. I wondered whether we were getting something of an Eddie Cochran type tale with one of the characters at one point, but Mitchell put paid to that. And every single character in this is going on a journey, and maybe that's like Utopia Avenue is an allegory for that, is the thing that they're all searching for and perhaps not going to find. And maybe that's a bit too on the nose, I don't know, but I really liked this story, and these characters would linger in my head, and I wanted the best for them. And the end of this novel left me somewhat heartbroken and bereft that I wasn't going to get more from this band that never even existed. It's a weird one because I felt like I did when I read The Lacuna. With The Lacuna by Barbara Kingsolver, I ended up forgetting that the protagonist wasn't real and went searching for this fake writer's books, despite the fact I've been told this writer never existed. And I feel the same with Utopia Avenue. I wish that this band existed so that I could go and explore their works and see the people that they were. But they don't exist, and that leaves you as a reader somewhat bereft, having to deal with this notion that you've just become so close to people that don't exist, and you can't even go and find out what they're doing with their lives. And I think that having characters seem so real is just something to wonder at and be grateful for. And that is that over. Those are my top 10 books that I read in 2020. If you've read any of these books and would like to discuss them, maybe some of them even made your top 10 lists, then let me know in the comments. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and until next time, that is all.